In this episode, psychology professor Dr. Louise Barrett explores supercharged apes and supersized minds, how to think like an animal. Dr. Barrett has studied the behavior of wild African primates for the past 25 years, along with studies of human behavior and ecology. In this talk, Louise offers her perspective on how humans and other species differ and how to reconcile our animal and cultural natures.
Thanks. So this isn't what this is meant to look like. This was meant to have a picture of a small baboon looking very, very thoughtful. So it was a bit like this. So just imagine that. So I don't know what went wrong there, but we won't worry about it. So the first part of the title that's Supercharged Apes and Supersized Mind, I'm going to deal with that as we come to the end of the talk, because what I want to do first of all is think about how we think about animals and how we might work towards thinking more like an animal. Now, we are animals, obviously, but how might we think of animals who aren't like us? And as Matt said, you know, and it was about almost exactly 30 years ago that I went to Uganda to study for my PhD, and I studied these rather splendid creatures, the grey-cheeked mangabe. So I was there for about 2 years studying them, and then after that, as he said, I moved on to look at chakma baboons in South Africa. So these are large terrestrial primates. So the mangabes live up trees, in forest. The chakma baboons lived in a sort of more like a low-lying Mediterranean-type habitat on the coast in Western Cape of South Africa. And just to show you what vervet monkeys look like, we now have worked on vervet monkeys for the past 10 years. We've just had our 10-year anniversary on the vervet monkey project. So these are also small semi-terrestrial monkeys. They spend a lot of time up the trees as well as on the ground. And so really, for almost my entire adult life, I've spent my time living in two worlds, the world of the monkeys and the human world. And it's always been interesting to me how these two things compare and contrast. Because when you're out with the monkeys, it's a kind of interesting thing, because you suddenly realize how constructed our world is. Because days of the week don't really mean anything anymore when you're out all day, every day with the monkeys. There isn't a Monday to Friday and a weekend in the same sense that we have it. Days of the week don't mean anything, and our clock time doesn't mean anything. You're just out when the sun comes up, and you go home when the sun goes down. So I find it really interesting to suddenly think, oh, there is a different way of being, that you live in this different mode of time. And then you come back to the human world and you realize how very strange our world is, particularly, because we do these kinds of things. It's a bit slow, there we go. So we do things like this. These are all absolutely real book titles. So we are creatures that think teabag folding is an interesting hobby. And, one in which you can become highly skilled. I'm now feeling bad in case there are any teabag folders in the room and I've somehow desperately insulted them. But this has always been interesting to me, this contrast between our human world that's full of all this very strange stuff and the world of the primates, because we are also primates, we are animals. So that's always gripped me. But when I first went out to study monkeys, I wasn't interested in psychology or anything like that at all. I was an ecologist, and I was interested in what they ate and where they went and how they avoided predation. And this is mostly as much as I ever really saw of the mangabes. They would be up in the canopy against sort of a backlit sky, and every so often you'd see this monkey pop out. And mostly I knew what they were eating because of what fell on my head, and it wasn't always food. So when I was working on the mangabes, I just saw them as these animals very high up. I didn't have a real sense of them. But when you work on terrestrial primates, when you work on animals like baboons, they're walking around with you, and you're with them, and they were very well habituated. We could get very close to them, and you could you can even smell them, and that's something David Attenborough never tells you about, is like how things smell, and they're quite stinky. But it's kind of if I ever get a whiff of it now when we're out in the vervets, I get very nostalgic in a way. So yeah, it's a bit, it's not quite like a skunk, but it's got that same pungent nature. It's not for everybody, but if you like it, you really like it. So once I was out with the baboons, walking around with them all day, every day, you can't but help think, well, how do they see the world? What are they thinking about? Why are they doing what they're doing? You get pulled into thinking about psychology, and you get pulled into thinking about how other animals might see the world, even if you don't want to. So then I had this kind of weird thing of thinking, oh yeah, you see them doing very, very familiar things, and you think, yeah, they obviously see the world just like us. They've got colour vision, and they've got hands, and so they're obviously thinking very similar thoughts. And then they would do something really odd, and you would think, oh, they don't quite see the world in the same way. So you sort of flip-flop between those two things. And it is really very easy to see ourselves in other animals. So you can look at this baboon. She's like really Karen. He's only little. You didn't have to do that to him, did you? You could just have let him play with the toys with you. You've got to learn to share. Right? So you can see these things in other animals. You can see these things in the baboons. We can, in the vervets, we have this little chap. Again, it's taken a bit long to shift. I don't want to press it again in case it doesn't go. Let's try again. Yes. So we had this little vervet. And we are convinced he's the voice of his generation. Look at him. He even, so there it's like, yeah, and his name, we called him Bob Dylan. He was Dylan. So it's very easy for us to see ourselves in these creatures. But it's very easy for us to see ourselves in anything. This is a picture of someone's can opener, just taken from the right angle. Nothing else has been done to it. And, if you add like a bit of, sort of stick on googly eyes to anything, you can humanize anything. So this is, if where the internet is like, particularly at the moment, the internet is this like pit of despair that you must never enter. But if you want something to cheer you up, go to this site called eye bombing. And it's just people who've got googly eyes and they've stuck them on things out in the world. So there's all kinds of vegetables in, googly eyes and office equipment. And there's also a link on the page to the Googly Eye Foundation. And if you want to join in with this, they will send you your own pack of googly eyes for free, because they think it's a sort of public service that we should all make the world into this happier, more human place. And so if you go to the website, it's just full of inanimate objects looking increasingly horrified. So it's well worth a half an hour of your time. So we can see emotions, these facial expressions. We can see that these inanimate objects are having there's something shocking has happened clearly here. And it's very, it's kind of, we understand that that's sort of some kind of radio at the end there. It's not animate. But it can be more tricky when we do have other animate beings, and we see behaviours that look very familiar to us. And so we have to be a bit careful. So this, for example, was published in the Daily Mail, and the headline, it's a picture of a chimpanzee at a sanctuary in Africa, and one of the other chimpanzees sadly passed away, and as he was taken out of the enclosure, all the other chimpanzees gathered to watch what was happening. And in the headline, it said, "Is this haunting picture proof that chimps really do grieve?" Now, it may well be that that's the case. They may well have very similar emotions to us. I'm not denying the fact that animals can and probably do share many emotions, but I don't think we can just do it on what it looks like to us. Maybe they're thinking, how come he gets to ride in that wheelbarrow? Right? It's equally likely. And the other reason we have to be very cautious and careful, I think, is because I want to ask you this. Is this haunting picture proof that pears really do grieve? Whoops, that's gone too far. So this is an artist, Victoria Ivanova, and again, you should look up her work. She's got all these, so the interesting thing here is she hasn't bothered with the googly eye or anything else other than just taken sort of slightly misshapen pears and arranged them in these tableaus where they present this picture of various kinds of emotions. So there's a very nice one as well of pears at an art gallery, all looking at the art and looking very unhappy about it. They're clearly not contemporary art fans, that's clear. So this is why we have to be careful, because we can't just use our intuition, and we can't use the same sort of things that we use with each other, because we don't have the same means of checking whether we're accurate or not, because we can't talk to the other species with whom we share the world. So we have to express a bit more caution. Now, I'm not saying that means, I have a dog, I talk to her as though she has a degree from Harvard, right? I believe she understands every word I say. And I don't think it does either of us, any harm whatsoever. But if we're going to look at other animals scientifically and try to understand more about how they really do see the world, then we have to leave that kind of everyday anthropomorphic stance behind. And one of the reasons, I can give you an example of that, right? So with the baboons. So when we were at the baboon site, there were also other animals on the reserve, and one of them was the ostrich. And this isn't from our field site, but it just gives you an idea of what an ostrich nest looks like. It doesn't look like very much at all. It's sort of like a kind of clearing in the earth, and then a bunch of ostriches lay their eggs in it, and then the male and the female will protect and incubate them. So, ostrich eggs are really big, and if the baboons found a nest unattended, they would be in it like flies, like a rat up a drain pipe. They were really into it, and they were all over trying to steal the eggs from the nest, because think about the size of an ostrich nest, and mostly these baboons are eating little bits of vegetation, hard sort of sedge-like roots that are very dense and hard to chew and not very nutritionally fulfilling or dense. So an egg is like the biggest prize you can imagine. It's like that whole buffet for you. And so when they found that egg, what would happen was they would run in. The most dominant male he'd sit in the middle of the nest with all the eggs, and he would start picking them up and dropping them, and picking them up and dropping them. And after a while, he would get the angle right, quite accidentally, drop it, and the egg would smash, and then he would dive in and start eating the egg. So he would be distracted, and all the other baboons would run in, grab an egg, and run out into the bush, into the veldt. So when we first arrived at the reserve, the reserve manager said to us, the baboons are terrible. They are terrible. They're so malicious. They just go into these ostrich egg nests and they raid them for fun. They just leave all the eggs scattered around in the veldt, and they don't even bother to eat them. And, it's like they're just terrible animals. And then when you saw it, what you realised was happening is that all these baboons would run out into the grasslands and the surrounding bush with their prize egg, and then they would sit there and drop it on the ground, and pick it up and drop it on the ground, and pick it up and drop it on the ground for like 20 minutes, half an hour at a time. And they had no understanding of how those eggs broke. And an ostrich egg is really tough, right? You can stand on them. And they don't know. So here's a male running off with his egg, like very excited. And like I say, you can stand on these eggs. They're so tough and strong. They're really, really thick shells. So you really have to hit it on something hard in order for it to break. And I never saw any baboon make that connection. So these are brainy, intelligent animals, and they didn't understand what caused the eggs to break. If they did it, it was a complete accident. So this has got stuck, I think. Nope, there we go. So yeah, you can stand on them. They're that tough. So they never would understand that you need to hit it on something hard, a rock or something like that, to break it. They would just keep dropping it and dropping it and dropping it on a soft, sandy soil, on grass. Nothing was going to happen. And then they eventually get bored and walk away and leave them. And so there were these eggs just scattered all around the environment, not because they were malicious or anything, but just because they completely failed to understand how to achieve their goal. And if they did accidentally crack one, on the like hitting a rock or something, they wouldn't associate it with the rock, they'd associate it with their own behaviour. So you would see these baboons who would just like pick rocks up and go, and nothing would happen. And it's because the one time that they did accidentally do it, they would always fumble it. And he would fumble it, and it would hit the ground and smack it onto a rock, and then they'd go, I've cracked it, So they'd be sitting there doing this, and nothing would happen. And I found it really fascinating, because it's like, far from being cunning and malicious, they were clearly just rather clueless. And so that's the interesting, juxtaposition I think you get when you are out every day seeing things that really are reminiscent of your own behaviour, and then at the same time suddenly being brought face to face with an animal who doesn't understand the world in the same way that you do, who doesn't have the same basic understanding of physical causality that like a 2-year-old baby does. So what that led me to think about is you can have very similar behaviours, but they're clearly being produced by very different mechanisms, very different psychological mechanisms. And we mustn't, so I got quite interested in that, of thinking about how that could be, how that could work. And I became more and more interested in the psychological side of things, and I started looking beyond the primates and looking at all other different kinds of animals, and that's what led me into finally having, so much I'd found out and so much I wanted to talk about that I ended up, writing a whole book about it. And the other thing that I came to realise was sometimes the different mechanisms don't even have to be psychological mechanisms. They can be something else entirely. So to illustrate that, I just want to take a little bit of a detour, a digression, but it's not really, it makes the point really well. It just comes back to the human world again. And it's about a little discussion of age, sex, and how our eyeballs change. So many of you all know this, that as you get older, the lenses in your eyes harden, and it becomes harder to focus. So we get increasingly long-sighted, increasingly far-sighted as we age. And there are studies that show women tend to get prescription glasses earlier than men do. So it was assumed there was there must be a sex difference in the rate at which the eyes deteriorate. And there was this is one of my favourite studies, and they did a meta-analysis of all the studies that have been done. They got all the studies where they'd found this sex difference and decided to look at it. And what they found by comparing all the studies was that the only time you see a sex difference is when you have a difference in the age at which the glasses are prescribed. But when you have in all the studies where they actually looked at the physical ability of the eye to focus, there was no sex difference at all. So you had this weird result. It doesn't seem to be the case that men and women's eyes age at different rates, but women get prescribed glasses earlier. Okay. Now, has anyone got any idea of why this could be potentially? Because what do we do when we can't see things when we're getting older? We hold them away from us like this. And men, on average, are taller than women. And they have longer limbs. And so what happens is, everyone's trying to hold it as far away as possible, and so it's vanity, basically. Women's vanity doesn't get them as far as men's does. At a certain point, you can't see it anymore. Vanity has to be, put aside, and you have to go and get glasses. But men have a bit more. Women just run out of arm. Men have just that little bit more arm, and then they can reach a little bit further, and then they wait longer to get their prescription glasses. So there is a sex difference, but it's not in your eyeballs, it's in your arms. And that's, I think, an important lesson to realise, is that we might see the reasons why animals see the world differently to us, because here it's arms, not eyes, that make all the difference. It's the body that matters, rather than some psychological aspect of perception and the ability to physically focus. It's about how well you can achieve that by using another part of your body to do so. So we have you can have different mechanisms that produce similar behaviours, and the other thing is that bodies also matter. The way you're physically put together can make a difference to how you achieve things in the world. And that is an important thing to take home, I think, because other animals can be very different from us in their physical bodies. So what I want to introduce you to now are what I think are two very useful concepts if you would also like to think more like an animal. If you would like to look at other animals around you and try to understand a bit more about how they see things might differ from how we see things. And the first concept I want to introduce you to is this concept known as the Unbelt, which was a term coined by an Estonian biologist in the early 20th century called Jakob von Uxküll, which is a marvellous name. And basically, the Unbelt just means the world as perceived by the organism. So what he's getting at there is that we can all be occupying the same environment, and we won't perceive the same things in it because of our differential sensitivity. So this is a flower, the one I've now got to do left and right things, and I can't do that at the best of times, but now I've got to reverse myself and everything. So the flower on the left, the yellow flower, I don't know why I just didn't say yellow. The yellow flower is the way we see it, and the other one is the same flower under ultraviolet light. And then that black section you see in the middle there, that's a nectar guide that pulls in bees. And so they're sensitive to ultraviolet light, so they can use that to find the nectar in a flower. And we're not sensitive to that, so ultraviolet light is not part of our Unbelt naturally. We have the skills to make machines that can tap into other Unbelts like that, but it's not part of ours. And so this notion of realizing that the world may look very different to other organisms is, I think, a key to understanding how other organisms might think. And one of the so think about dogs again. So here she is, here is my dog. That's her in summer, and they're in minus 30 degrees in winter. So that will be us on Saturday, I imagine, apparently. So dogs are driven more by smell. They have very, very good sense of smell. We all know that. They're not very good at detecting static objects, but they're very good at detecting motion. So I would get, and they don't have colour vision. So I would get very annoyed and cross with my dog, take her out for a walk, you throw the ball and then she loses it. And she can't see it. And you can see a bright red ball sitting in the grass, and she runs around, and she's like, and you're like, oh, you idiot, why can't you find it? And it's because to her, it's not there. And I say she lost the ball, but I lost the ball for her. I wasn't making sure she was paying attention when I threw it so that she could follow the trajectory. So now she doesn't know where the ball is. And then I would do this thing where I go, right, I'll go and get it. And I'd walk towards the ball, and then she would start running around in front of me. And then just before I got to the ball, she'd jump on it and get it. And it's like, you knew where it was all the time. Why are you doing this to me? You're trying to make me walk further. What are you doing? And of course, she was using me as a beacon, as she does when we walk all the time normally. So she was homing in on me, and then as she was getting closer and closer, she could finally pick up the scent, and then she could get the ball. And until you understand that, you just think, you just have this idea that she's toying with you, or that she's very dumb, she's not that clever, it's true. But she's a border collie, but she's not as smart as you'd expect a border collie to be. So Peter, my husband, he calls her a borderline collie, which So even, we can do this with our pets. We can understand a bit more about our pets' world by tapping in more to their Unbelt. And the other nice thing about the Unbelt, which I discovered in my research, is some animals have only very simple nervous systems. They don't have that many neurons to play with. They don't have large brains, but they seem to do really clever things. So how are they managing it? And if you look at a lot of insects, they do really quite amazing things that you wouldn't imagine they'd be able to do with so few neurons at their disposal. So one of the things that I got interested in was how small creatures like this solve their problems. So crickets, for example, a female cricket has to she homes in on the sounds that a male cricket makes. So male crickets produce what are called songs. They rub their back legs together, they stridulate, and they produce these rhythmic chirps. And each species has its own pattern of rhythmic chirps, and those are called songs. And a female will respond to the song of her own species, and she will also respond to the song of the best male. And that's usually the male who can sing loudest. And then she has to sort of pick that song out against the background of all the other noises in the world, compare the songs of different males to see which one is the loudest and the best, and then find that male. And that seems like a quite complex set of things to do with such a small brain, with so few neurons. But once you understand and get into how the female cricket perceives the world, it's not such a difficult task at all. Those three different problems collapse down into one. And it's because of the way the female cricket is put together. So I'm sure you know this, but crickets have ears on their knees. Okay, so their eardrums are on the front of their legs on their knees. So that's a close-up there of what the eardrum looks like on its leg. And because they're quite small and their knees are very close together, so that means that you wouldn't be able to tell the direction of a sound because they're very close. We tell direction of sound quite well because our ears are widely separated on either side of our heads, which means we can tell which direction a sound is coming from. So the way the crickets do it is they get sound from the inside and the outside. So is this going to... No, it's not going to show up. So what you can see there, this is like a sound source transmitting sound at the cricket. And on the outside there, these are the cricket's legs. The sound is hitting the eardrum from the outside. It's travelling through the air and hitting the eardrum from the outside. But it's also the tube in the middle of the cricket, the outline of the cricket there. That's a modified breathing tube. Crickets breathe through little things there are little openings to the outside called spiracles, and air moves through what are called tracheae. So this particular tracheae is a modified breathing tube, and sound can travel through, it enters through the spiracles on the side of the insect's body, and it travels through the tracheae and hits the eardrum from the inside. So sound hits from two directions. It hits from the outside and inside. And depending on where the sound source is, the time taken for it to do that will differ. So on the side closest to the sound, the inside and outside roots will be more or less the same, and on the other side, it will take longer via the inside than the outside. Oh, sorry, the other way around. On the side closest, it hits the eardrum on the outside of the knee first, and it takes longer to travel through the body. And that differential of when the sounds hit from the inside and the outside makes the ear directional, like ours. So the cricket can then tell which direction the sound is coming from. And what it then does is the sound closest to it and the loudest makes the eardrum activate more. That reaches the activation threshold of a neuron sooner, and that neuron fires first. And what the cricket does is simply turns in the direction of whichever neuron fires first. The neuron is tied to its motor system in such a way that the sound it hears on that side, it will turn in that direction. So what the cricket does is every time it hears a chirp, just the beginning of the chirp, it turns in the direction of the neuron that has fired first. And in that way, it gets steered towards the source of the sound. So the female isn't comparing different songs by different males at all. She's just responding to the beginning of each chirp. And the reason they have to be different rhythms is the crickets differ in the way their neurons are set up in each species. And then what happens is that if the chirps came too quickly, the female the neuron doesn't have time to recover between chirps, and she wouldn't be able to track the male effectively. If the chirps are too widely spaced, then she would go off track because she'd wander off in between different chirps. She wouldn't know which way to turn, and so she'd drift off track. So the male song has become tuned to the female's body, so that just by turning in the direction of the chirp she hears first, she will inevitably find the male. And that male will be the best male because the loudest song will activate her eardrums more extensively. Then the other nice thing is, you've got to say, well, she's still got to pick a male song out from across the background of all the other songs in all the other noises in the world. And the other thing is she doesn't do that at all, because the structure of the tracheae is such that it filters out all the other noises. The only sound it can transmit effectively is the sound of her own male producing his song. So for a female, so her body essentially is acting as a filter. It filters out all the extraneous information that she doesn't need, and it allows her to home in on a male of her own species. So what that means is, rather than it being a very difficult problem that the female cricket has to solve, basically the world only contains songs of her own species. She doesn't hear anything else. She literally only has ears for the best male. And then just this week, I was just reading just yesterday, and I didn't have time to put it in the talk, but there's a study that's just come out on bees, and the bees, the male, when they mate with the female, their semen has some kind of toxin in it, and it makes females temporarily blind, so that the female doesn't move around very much after she's been mated and doesn't mate with other males. So the male can protect his investment in the female. And you're like, that's awful. But the interesting thing is, you can see how by altering the female's Unbelt, the male is controlling the female's Unbelt. He's making it harder for her to perceive the world visually, and that keeps her in a more contained place. And that's much easier than trying to track the female around himself, follow her around, and keep her away actively from other males. So by altering the Unbelt, he alters the female's ability to act in the world. This similar kind of thing works for brainy creatures as well. So New Caledonian crows are amazing birds. They use tools, and they can make tools, and they can modify tools, and they can use a tool to make another tool. They do all this amazing stuff, and they are incredibly bright and brainy birds, as are all the members of the crow family. And the interesting thing about the New Caledonian crow is everyone's like, yes, these are the brainiest of the crows, and that's why they're so good at using tools. But if you give crows tasks where they have to, that aren't related to tool use at all, their performance doesn't really differ from other members of the crow family. So in this study, for example, all you need to worry about here is really nothing to do with the picture, the points on the graph or anything like that, but you can see that the patterns are very similar. So the top panel, the top two panels, they're from a carrion crow. The middle panels are New Caledonian crows, and the bottom panel is from a woodpecker finch, which is also a tool-using bird. And this was a task where there was two pots, and they had different colour covers, and they rewarded the cover that was orange, and the food was always in that, and the birds were trained until they recovered food only from the orange side of things. Then they reversed it and made it a different colour, so it would be now a blue cover that would indicate where food was, and they look at how quickly the birds can shift from knowing orange is where food is to knowing where that blue is where food is. And what this shows is that if you give a task like that, you don't get any difference across the crows. The New Caledonian crow doesn't perform any better. So it seems like it's not as what's going on here? Is it just that its brain is really highly specialized for tool use? Is it only cognitively specialized to use tools? And it may well be that it's something like that. But another thing that's important for New Caledonian crows, which was revealed by this paper, is that they have much more extreme binocular vision than any of the other birds. So they have, as you can see in this photo here, their eyes point forwards much more than other members of the crow family. Their eyes would point sideways. And they have very straight beaks, so they can hold a tool in their beak and visually guide it. They can see what they're doing when they're doing it. If you're another kind of crow, if you think about it, you've got a tool, you put it in your beak, you stick it down into a hole, but you have to turn your head to the side to do that. So you can't see what you're doing as you're manipulating the tool. You have to manipulate it, and then you have to have a look at what you've done. And you can manipulate it, and then you have a look at what you've done. But a New Caledonian crow, they can see what they're doing when they're doing it. So their ability to use tools, this great facility with solving problems with tools and using tools, is because, I'm just going to go back to that one. As you can see here, the stick falls perfectly alongside the very straight bill, and the bird is looking straight down the stick while it's using it. So you don't necessarily have to look into its brain to understand why its tool use is so much more effective. It's so much more effective because it's built in the right way. Its body has given it the capacity to use tools in this particular way. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be brainier at all. It's just better at using tools because its body is better able to use those tools. So that brings me to the next concept that I think is very useful to try and understand how other animals might see the world, and that's the concept of affordances, which is also, the Unbelt is a very old idea. The notion of affordances is a very old idea, and they've just been neglected, and we need to sort of reinvigorate them. And like my friend and colleague Serge Pellis always says, if you want new ideas, read old books. And he's quite right, because a lot of it is already out there, and we just have kind of neglected certain things. So James Gibson suggested that the world around us is not necessarily, it's full of objects, but we have to understand that those objects, they're really possibilities for action that the environment offers to us, depending on the structure of our bodies. So, as we see here, a knife and fork afford eating if you have hands to grasp the knife and fork. And if you are a goldfish, they are not going to afford you eating. Shoes afford putting our feet into them and walking around, and if you're a Labrador puppy, they afford chewing, okay? As many of us have learned to our cost. So the notion of affordances is that we can then understand how an animal might solve its problems in the world and see the world by recognizing what it can do with the world. That it's not just about perceiving the world in the way that von Uxküll talked about. It's not simply your visual perception of the world, it's also what can you do with it? How can you act on the world? And obviously, your body is a big part of determining how that will work. So, I think this picture is a David Hockney, one of his photographs that he called joiners, which is when he used Polaroid photographs to make these kind of cubist-like pictures of people engaged in particular activities. So this one's called the crossword puzzle. So what you can see here is it's like different shots of people at different times as they're doing the crossword puzzle together, and then he puts them into this one image. And David Hockney, always said, well, photography is never going to be as good as painting because painting takes time. And so when you look at a finished painting, you're also looking at the time it took for the artist to produce it, whereas a photograph is just an instant. And then when he discovered Polaroid photography, he's like, now I can bring time into photography in the same way I do as painting. This takes time for me to make these things. But this is also a good way of thinking about affordances, because it's looking that if you want to understand what the affordances of the environment are, you have to move around. You have to check everything out from all different angles. You have to see it, what you can do with it, and you have to act on it. You have to pick it up and play around with it if you can. And this is what these nice joiner images get at. That perception is an active process. It's not you're not sitting there like a camera just receiving information from the world. You are actively engaged in seeking out what the world will offer you. And the world is telling you what to do. Okay? So a good example of that, I think, is who goes to the sports centre at the university? The First Choice Sports Centre. Who goes there? People go there? Yes, and so so Tim Hortons is on the left as you leave, and then there are these doors. And doors are set up to tell you what to do with them. So those doors over there, behind you, with the horizontal bars, they are saying, push me. And doors that have vertical handles or knobs, they're saying, pull me. And when you go to the First Choice Saving Centre and you want to leave, there's a vertical handle that's going, pull me, and you have to push it. And I remember when it first opened, it was just after we got here, people were going, we're locked in, because you were pushing it and pushing it, but like pulling it and pulling it and pulling it, and nothing was happening. And then finally someone would come along and either know that you needed to push or accidentally push it, and everyone would go, we're free, we can all go home. And it infuriates me to this day. And you see, this is a hilariously good time of the year to be at the university because all the first years have arrived, all the new students have arrived, and you just see them like standing there yanking at this door, and everyone's just like, my sweet summer child, you need to learn. So that's affordances. The world is crying, is telling you what to do. The world is informing you about what you can do with it. And that's a good way, I think, of trying to understand how other animals might see it. So this is a good example of consort takeovers in baboons, where understanding the affordances of the environment was the key to understanding a particular pattern of behaviour. So as you can see here, that's an adult male and an adult female. The adult female is only about half the size of the male, and when she's fertile, when she can conceive, her rear end swells up, as you can see there, in this big pink swelling. And when that happens, one male will stick with that female throughout that entire period of her swelling, and in that way he can ensure that he will be the father of any offspring that she subsequently bears. And these times when the male guards the female in this way. Those are called consortships. The male is consorting the female. And in this particular study, and other males try to take the female away from the male. They compete over these consortships. And in East African baboons, this happens much more often than in South African baboons. And what happened in this particular instance was, during the day, out on the plains, older, more experienced males were able to consort females very well and resist any attempts at taking over the consortship by younger males. They were absolutely able to resist any form of aggressive attack. But at night, on the cliffs, what would happen was the female would go to, she'd get up on the cliffs and go to bed and go to sleep with one male, and in the morning she'd leave with a new male, and that would usually be a younger male, a younger, more aggressive male. So it's like, what's going on here? Are these younger males, do they have some kind of sneaky tactic that they use, under cover of darkness to sort of, persuade the female away from the male? What's going on? And in fact, the detailed analysis of the males' tactics revealed that their behavior was consistent across days and times and the day and the night. So the older, more experienced males would use social tactics. They had experience to know when they should, take the female and approach other females. And because if you do that, and a male tries to attack them, all the females might join in because they'll all think they're being attacked. And so they'll defend themselves against what they perceive as an attack, and then that will be directed at this poor unfortunate male, and he'll run away, and then the male's consortship with the female remains intact. Or sometimes males grab infants and hold them against each other, and that sort of stops any aggressive attack in its tracks, because they use the infant as a buffer because no one wants to attack the infants. So they would have all these kind of these tactics like this, and they would use them equally well. They didn't differ in their behaviour. And the younger males didn't have all this social skill, so they would just aggressively try to attack the male and remove the female by brute force, so to speak. And the difference in the reason why that you saw this particular shift in who was successful in consort takeovers was really the affordances of the environment. So it's the difference, it's not anything in the difference in the males, it's a difference in what the cliffs afford relative to wide open plains. So the cliffs, here we go, whoops, no. So cliffs are much higher, everything is narrower, there's less room for manoeuvre, and so on the cliffs, the older experienced males just couldn't use their social tactics. They were much more constrained. They had visual distance was reduced. They couldn't see what other animals were around. They couldn't get in close proximity to the animals they needed to. So they were kind of much more constrained, and the younger, more aggressive males could attack the males with impunity, and they had no recourse to any other strategy. So then the younger, more aggressive males could take over. So in order to understand why these tactics worked in the way they did and how they differed and why they differed across space and time, what needed to be done was to bring in the structure of the environment, the affordances of the environment to these different kinds of males. And once that was added, it explained almost all of the variation in males' ability to sustain their consortships. So without that understanding of how the animals are using the environment, we wouldn't have understood the difference in male mating tactics. So that's one example. Another example is how you can use the structure of the environment to solve your problems. So this fish is called a mudskipper. That's not a fish, it's not there yet, so I get confused. There it is. So this is a mudskipper, which I think is a delightful looking creature, and they are fish that can feed on land. So they come out on land, and they've got quite bony fins. They come out on land and they can feed while they're out there. Now, of course, when you're in the water, you can just suck things, you just suck floating particles in from the water, and that's how you can get food, but you can't do that on land. Well, not easily anyway. You'd have to have quite a lot of puff to be able to do that. So what these mudskippers do is they bring a mouthful of water with them onto land, and then they shoot it out at high power and high pressure, and then they suck it back in again. And what they do is it acts like a tongue. So it allows them, they shoot water out, it picks up what's on the ground, and they suck it back in again. So they use the environment to augment and enhance capacities that they otherwise wouldn't have. And they do it much more cheaply than having to evolve and produce an actual tongue. And this gives them the freedom to operate effectively both on land and in water, because the tongue's not so great and not so useful in water. So this is another way in which the animals can exploit the affordances of the environment. They exploit the way that water can be used to in that way it has the viscosity, so to speak, to allow it to be used to pick up food from the environment. So that's kind of a nifty example of how, again, you can understand something about how animals are dealing with their problems by turning to the environment as the source. Tuna fish are very interesting because tuna fish can't swim as fast as they actually do. Okay, no one's told the tuna fish, so they just carry on swimming very, very fast indeed. But they can swim 7 times faster than they have power in their muscles. So if you do an analysis of how much force their muscles can generate, they shouldn't be able to swim as immensely fast as they do. And then it took some fluid dynamicists, it took physicists to work out what was going on. So what tuna do use their muscle power for is to flick their tails very powerfully. And when they flick their tail very powerfully to one side and then the next side, they create these vortices in the water. So these are kind of like whirlpools in the water. And when they do that, those whirlpools effectively push the fish through the water. And that's what gives them that extra burst of speed. So there's a philosopher called Andy Clark, and he says, this is the way we think about tuna is we shouldn't think of the swimming machine as the tuna by itself. The real swimming machine is the tuna plus the water plus the vortices it creates and exploits and uses, and that's what constitutes the whole swimming machine. And he sort of says, as for tuna, so for humans. And this is where I get to my points about humans, which is that's what we are like. We are using the structure of our environment to augment and enhance our abilities in a way that gives us greater speed, so to speak. It gives us the ability to do things we wouldn't otherwise be able to do without that ability. And that all, in a large part, stems from the fact that we need to think about the structure of our bodies, that we tend, and the bits of our bodies that we take completely for granted, but are really important and really interesting. So this is the hand of Australopithecus sediba, which is a sort of human, don't know if it's necessarily an ancestor, but it's a human relative. And what you can see on here is that this is showing you its hand palm up. So that's its thumb there, and those are its fingers. And you can see it's got a very long thumb compared to the length of its fingers. And that's very human-like. Chimpanzees, if you hold your hand like this, and imagine there's another bit of finger that comes down to about here, right? That's how long chimpanzee fingers are, so they're about that long. So this is a sign that you've got increased manual dexterity, because when you have a long thumb, you can start opposing with your fingers. And this is what gives you pincer grips, the ability to pick things up in a fine way. And this is a interesting finding, because this is the brain of this creature is relatively small compared to humans. So it's got a small ape-like brain. Is there someone behind me? I can hear funny noises behind me. It has a small ape-like brain and very dexterous hands. So our manual dexterity came before we had the brains that we have now. That we were manually dexterous, we could do many things with our hands, potentially make tools, potentially manufacture tools, and augment our capacity to deal with the world way before we had the large brains that we have today. So one of the things that a dexterous hand gives you is, in this sense, is that it gives you the ability to throw things. You can throw them overarm and with power, if you can get that kind of grip on an object. So one suggestion is that these animals, although they were quite weedy, ape-like creatures, they became quite powerful predators because they could throw stones accurately and with power at other creatures who might be trying to eat them, the creatures that they wanted themselves to eat. So we take our dexterity completely for granted. It's not something that we think about very much. And the same is true, I think, of that we don't think about baboons in terms of their manual dexterity. So they're also very dexterous, and you can see here they can hold little seeds, right? They're holding it like this between their thumb and their finger. But baboons are very brainy creatures, relatively speaking, as far as monkeys go, and they're the most widespread monkey across Africa. They're found in all habitats. They're found from the north to the south, east to the west. And everyone sort of like says, oh yeah, it's because they're very brainy, they're very clever. But they also have hands that are very good for digging. And if you can dig, you can always find food, because you can get hold of subterranean storage organs like tubers and bulbs. And I think the key to understanding why baboons are so successful is really found in their hands, rather than thinking about their cleverness in other ways. And I think the same is largely true for us. So this should be seen as a source of wonder. Okay, no one gets excited and feels a sense of wonder when they hold a golf club. Okay. Well, I would, because I'd be going, why am I playing golf? That's like a good walk ruined. But this should be a source of wonder, because there's no other creature that can hold an object like this. So we all think that this kind of opposability is the key, being able to do this. The real opposability that's important is being able to do this. There's a bone in your hand that no other primate has, is what allows you to achieve this. And when you can do this, you can hold an object with this grip, where you've aligned your thumb with it, and you're squeezing, an oblique squeeze grip. You're squeezing it against the palm of your hand, and there's two things there. It's on the axis of your arm, it's extending your reach, and it means you can have a lot of power and control. So if you want to see this for yourself, pick up a stick or a spoon or a golf club as though you're picking up a suitcase. Okay. So hold it in this kind of grip, as you would if you were just picking up a bag. And now hold it above your head, and think about how much power you'd have if you were trying to hit someone with it. And now hold it with this unique grip, and see how much more power you have. You immediately feel the difference in how you go. If anyone would like to try hitting someone with it, please feel free. It's just here. But this is also the reason why we can make omelettes. Okay? Because we can, again, hold it, or crepes, or whatever. You can hold the pan like this with this same grip, and that's what allows you to flip it. Chimpanzees can only ever have scrambled eggs. That's their sadness of their lives. So we don't think of this as being intelligent. We take this completely for granted. But this is one of the most amazingly intelligent things you can do. I always say to my students when they feel a bit overwhelmed and they feel a bit, they can't understand things and they're feeling a bit stupid, and I go, don't worry, go home, have an omelette, have an omelette, open a can of beer, twist the top off a bottle, and just revel in the amazing display of natural intelligence that you have just shown. Okay? You'll always feel better. There's advice that's good for all of us, I think. So yeah, this is key. And the other thing that I think comes from this is this dexterity is also linked to our ability to cook. So cooking has been seen, oh Lord, my manual dexterity is not working with me here. So cooking is something that we have a long history with, and it's been suggested that yes, this arose again as a point of having the manual dexterity to be able to control fire and to be able to chop up bits of animals so you can roast them more effectively, to process vegetable matter so that can be processed more effectively. So what you're doing basically when you're cooking things is you are helping the process of digestion. You're doing most of the digestion outside your body, okay? So, and that, as a consequence, is why we have much shorter guts than many other primates, because we don't have to have the food in our stomachs as long and in our guts as long to extract all the goodness out of it. And we also have much smaller teeth and smaller jaws, because we don't have to process the food with our own muscle power. We're using the power that comes from boiling and roasting and to achieve that for us. So if you think of cooking, you say, like, right, well, what is we've doing? We've released ourselves from the burden of all the effort it takes to digest food internally, and we've used cooking to digest our food externally. And so, again, that's how we should think of ourselves, as animals who are able to extend our boundaries and use tools in all these kinds of ways in order to relieve the burden on us and save us energy that we would otherwise have to use and put it into digestion. So we now use fossil fuels, we now use energy that comes from outside our bodies in all kinds of ways. And so if you work out how much an industrial human like us uses, we are now, if you worked out and all the energy we use to do all the things we do, and you sort of said, right, let's work out how big a monkey we would be if we put all that energy together and said, right, that's you, as that all that energy comes from your body, we would be 30,000 kilogram primates. We are all basically sitting here being King Kongs. The reason why we can do that is because we have extended our ability and how we work in the world by capitalizing on external sources of energy and external sources of digestion and external sources of thought. So we have very fuzzy boundaries. Humans have fuzzy boundaries. We think we're just these contained things, but we are outsourcing our digestion to our cooking process. We're outsourcing our memory to making notes on paper. And so when you think of all the things we do and the things we use, we've got written language. That saves you a lot of effort, being able to write things down. Post-it notes, memory sticks. You use wheels to power things. Everything you can see around you here, the glasses, you're using a pen, you're doing all the things we're doing is allowing us to extend our cognition and our thinking out into the world. And we store it in other people as well. So we are interdependent in this way, and we are fuzzy because our minds are not contained by our bodies. Our minds extend into the world. So we are supercharged apes. We're apes with great brain power who can do things that no other apes can do. But we can also do even more than that, because like a turbocharged engine, you take the exhaust fumes and you put it to drive more power, gas into the cylinder so that you get extra power out of your engine. That's what we're doing. When you write something down, you are supercharging yourself. You are giving yourself powers that you don't have to have, because you can cooperate on a larger scale if you have the ability to write things down and share them with other people in that way. So Andy Clark, again, who's the philosopher who talked about the tuna, he has said, which I think is a great quote, "We humans, we make our world smart so that our brains like ours can be dumb in peace." Which I think is a comforting message for us all. So our use of tools and artifacts allows us to do so much more than we would be able to do with our biological brains. And that's why we can achieve so much more than other animals. But at the same time, we still have to understand how it comes about because of things like our manual dexterity. And we also understand that we also live in our own Unbelt that just happens to be broader than other creatures, because we can use our tools to tap into other animals' Unbelts by making ultraviolet sensors and ultrasound detectors. But it doesn't detract from the fact that we are still creatures with an Unbelt, and we still respond to a world of affordances. So what I would just like to say is if you find that useful, you can use this to think about the other animals who occupy the worlds that you live in. I'm still trying to change this slide. Ooh. And then just recognize that there are other kinds of minds, because they live in other kinds of bodies, and they inhabit other kinds of environments where the affordances for them differ. And if we think like that, I think we'll get a better, more enriched understanding of what other animals are like. And if you apply these same kinds of lessons that I've been talking about to you now to ourselves, we'll also get a more satisfying understanding of our own psychology too. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions.